Hi everyone, this is Jason Bierach of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. Mo used to interview him, but he just came out with a new book, so I think my listeners are really going to enjoy this interview. He's a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He also is the book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian School Economics. He's an economics teacher, and his new book, which we are going to discuss today on this podcast, is The Skyscraper Curse, which is available for free for our listeners on the Mises Institute website. Dr. Mark Thornton, thank you for joining me again.
Hey, Jason, it's great to be back on the show.
Now, Mark, for our listeners who are not familiar with hearing something about the Skyscraper Curse, what exactly is it? When was this theory created? Who created it? You know, some of the basic stuff before maybe we talk about the details of your book and how you're integrating this with Austrian School Economics.
Well, the Skyscraper Curse is a very funny thing. It's the association of the building of a world record height skyscraper and a major economic crisis. And that sounds very bizarre, but I think it'll make a lot of sense once we get into some of the details. The Skyscraper Index was first published by a real estate analyst named Andrew Lawrence back in 1999, when he noticed this odd association that every time we have an economic crisis, somebody is in the process of building a record-setting height skyscraper. And when I saw that, most of the financial media at the time, back in 1999, they kind of dismissed it. They wanted to report on it, but then they said, you know, this is probably like any other indicator that Wall Street has come up with. It's probably a flash in the pan and will be dismissed as merely a spurious correlation. You know, like the Super Bowl index was supposed to be able to predict the stock market based on which league, the AFL or the NFL, the NFC, won the Super Bowl, but it's had a terrible track record since that time. In contrast, the skyscraper record has continued to be very good, and we've gone back and looked at some of the older data to show that it's been with us now for about 150 years. And so when I saw this, I didn't laugh it off, because I saw the Austrian School business cycle theory embedded in that indicator, that, you know, that basically the Austrian business cycle theory described this whole skyscraper curse perfectly. And so I set about trying to demonstrate how the skyscraper curse embodies the Austrian business cycle theory, and I published that article in 2005. It took me a while because all the mainstream journals just dismissed it out of hand as not having a testable hypothesis. So that's where the whole story started back almost 20 years ago.
Yeah, I remember you've been writing articles about this since even before the housing bubble. And like you said, with financial history, if you believe in the Austrian School of Economics, there's the credit boom and then the bust. But during the boom, there's, you know, lots of misallocations of capital. And so, you know, these skyscrapers, as you've highlighted in your book and in your articles in the past, seem to be like some of the most egregious examples of misallocations of capital.
That's right. It's a very good point. It's the Skyscraper Curse Index is only designed around the major boom-bust experiences in the financial past. You know, so we're talking about the Panic of 1907 and the Great Depression, things of that nature, not your average ordinary business cycles of the 1950s, for example, where you had, you know, small bubbles or booms and small corrective phases where most of the economy was largely unaffected and there was no true economic crisis. So this is not meant to be the general approach to business cycles, but to the really boom bust bubble type cycles that make history, basically. And this is where the record-setting skyscraper comes to the forefront, and it gives us a tangible example that we can actually dissect and see the nitty-gritty details of the Austrian business cycle theory in action, really for the first time. And it's something that previous to this we've had to talk about in very fuzzy generalities about stages of production and nebulous concepts that the average person doesn't understand. I think they'll be able to understand it in terms of the skyscraper curse.
That's a good point. And almost everyone who's been to New York City has seen the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, even the new Freedom Tower. These things are, as you pointed out in the book, they tend to be done either before, during, or immediately after, a bust. So we're in the height of the real estate bubble crashing, and here we are in Dubai more recently with Dubai building, that enormous tower, and then I think for temporarily it couldn't be finished. So there are real world examples showing that these skyscrapers, they don't get finished, whether it's the 1929 Great Depression that these things were being built, or it's more recently with the tower in Dubai, or you could provide some other recent examples as well.
Oh, absolutely. When we look back at the 19th century, we saw the pinnacle of American capitalism and things like the building of the canal network through, the northeast and through the Midwest, creating an agricultural industrial powerhouse. And then we saw later on the building of the railroad network across the entire country and all over the place, again igniting an economic boom of enormous consequences. But we also saw crises as a result of that in the canal building and in the railroad network building. And then later on, of course, late 19th, early 20th century, American factories become the pinnacle of American capitalism. America goes on to dominate the industrial world. But we had, lots of business cycles in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. We had the Panic of 1907, the Depression of 1921, and then, of course, the pinnacle of it all, the Great Depression, which saw the building of the Chrysler Building setting a world's record in 1929. That was the Wall Street Building in 1929. Then Chrysler in 1930, and then the Empire State Building in 1931. So we had a cluster of these record-setting skyscrapers, which is actually typically the case. Most of these economic crises are associated with multiple new records. For example, the Panic of 1907 occurred right in the process of the building of the Metropolitan Life Building, setting a record, and the Singer Building, setting a record the next year. And so you get these clusters of unusual economic activity, building these world record height skyscrapers. And then after the Great Depression, of course, things calmed down, only to be ignited at the end of the bubble of the 1960s, when you had World Trade Tower 1 and World Trade Tower 2 in New York and the Sears Building in Chicago, setting 3 records right in a row in the early 1970s. And of course, that was a signal of a more than decade-long economic slump in the United States and elsewhere. We were forced off of the gold standard, and we had high rates of inflation and high rates of unemployment, and along the way we had the oil crisis, going off of the gold standard, all sorts of negative things, losing the Vietnam War, Watergate. It was just a terrible decade of economic frustration that culminated in what would be called a depression of more than 10% unemployment and much more than 10% interest rates and 10% inflation in the early 1980s. And so, again, you get this clustering of records and a resulting big economic depression, really. The 1970s is referred to as the stagflation of the 1970s, but by a lot of measures, it was an economic depression. And so then we fast forward to the tech bubble in both Asia and in the United States, and we have a new record-setting skyscraper in Kuala Lumpur, the Petronas Towers. We had Taipei 101 in Taiwan, and so you have a new record at the sort of the beginning of the crisis during the tech bubble, and then you have another record being set at the end of the tech crises, and so again you get this same phenomenon going on, and then of course the skyscraper curse comes to light at this period of time, and I'm developing the theory paper during this time, and of course right after the tech bubble, of course we started the housing bubble, and because of my work in the skyscraper curse, I was more or less fully aware of the housing bubble that was going on, and I started writing about it in early 2004, and several times thereafter in public lectures and all sorts of things, podcasts and radio interviews, all that kind of thing. And then the Dubai Tower sets the record in August of 2007, and I made a short blog mention of that. I should have talked it up a lot more than I did, but this was at a time when, not just in the U.S., but pretty much around the world, stock markets were at record highs, unemployment was at near record lows, so all of the economy was, buzzing along, and everybody was making money, and so this idea that there's a bust coming ahead, everybody pretty much laughed me off.
Yep. Peter Schiff too.
But of course, it ultimately came to fruition.
Exactly. A lot of people, especially people on Wall Street, especially people in the housing and real estate industry, and even Ben Bernanke, because there's the videos of him forever now on the internet of him saying there is no housing bubble, subprime is contained, etc. Housing prices have never nationally gone down together, blah, blah, blah. And, Peter Schiff, the great speech that he gave at the mortgage bankers, they almost laughed him off the stage. So I'm sure you were given similar treatment, but look at what happened during the housing bubble. It almost collapsed everything.
Yeah, and the book details all of this stuff for the recent cycles, as well as in the second half of the book, we go back to all of these episodes, the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 1970s, the tech bubble, the housing bubble, and I show, what economists were saying at the time before the trouble actually started, and almost uniformly, the Austrian school economists, going back into the 1920s, were fully aware that what was happening in the economy was both unnatural because of central banks and dangerous because of central bank policy, and consequently, the Austrians' mainstream professional colleagues were saying pretty much the opposite. Irving Fisher in 1929 was saying everything was fine, everything was great. He didn't foresee the possibility of any kind of crises. And he kept that same attitude even after the stock market broke and even after it started to crater. And he was telling people to buy and hold even at the very bottom of the stock market after people had lost 90 or 95% of their money. It was a horrible bloodbath. And the same thing happens in the 1960s. The Keynesians were claiming credit for killing off the business cycle in 1969, proclaiming their victory, saying we'll no longer need to study business cycles, whereas the Austrians were, calling out an alarm that monetary policy was going to be very destructive, that federal spending was going to be very destructive, that the Bretton Woods system would be in danger, and all of the terrible consequences that could or would actually take effect. Ludwig von Mises, the namesake of the Mises Institute, was making public lectures, even though he was very old and very frail. He felt it was that important to push himself to get out there and to sound the alarm bells. And of course, Henry Hazlitt, the great Austrian writer for the mainstream media, I thought he was retired, but then I found out that he actually wrote over 170 articles for the Los Angeles Times on this very problem. And of course, Murray Rothbard was writing about this on a very regular basis and was making one correct prediction after another. And so I show all this happening, and if you're an Austrian proponent of Austrian economics, you'll get a great laugh out of all this. And if you're a mainstream proponent, you won't want to read this at all, because it's actually kind of funny in certain spots.
Yeah, to add to your points there, Irving Fisher actually said, I think a month or two before the October 1929 stock market crash, that stocks had reached a permanently high plateau. So it was one of the worst calls in modern history. But, before we talk about the Cantillon Effect and the track record of Austrian School Economics, forecasting credit bubbles bursting and crashes, what's your opinion then on the current construction of skyscrapers now? So in the book, you mentioned the Jeddah Tower in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, they do have a lot of surplus. People view the Saudis as very rich, but they made a lot of social program promises. The oil price has had a rally recently, but, the days of $100 oil without maybe that crashing the economy are probably gone. So you said that Saudis are building an enormous, to get a record for the skyscraper record now?
Yes, they are. In near Jeddah, out in the desert, they're building the Jeddah Tower, or the Kingdom Tower, and they originally wanted to build a skyscraper that was 1 mile tall, but the engineer said that such a structure would crack the Earth's crust. It was so heavy, and so they pared that back to 1 kilometer height. And even much of that is just empty space at the very top. So it's only going to break the record if it's completed by about 12 stories. So it's a huge investment project. And it would almost be ready to set the record later this year, but it's been on hold since November. It's been on hold since last November. Both the builder, the person in charge of construction, and the owner of the said structure have both been caught up in the corruption scandal in Saudi Arabia. So the project has been on hold, and so I don't know what that means, but it's not really the actual building of a structure that causes an economic crisis. It's
a signal
that it's just a signal, and it's really monetary policy that's driving both the new record skyscrapers and the eventual economic crises. So the fact that the building has been stalled, I think, is not as consequential is the fact that, they passed all the permits, they got all the financing, and they started the construction. And it's something out of left field, so to speak, that the construction has been delayed in this way.
Mark, the other signal that's happening now, and it's been going on actually for a while now, like probably more than 10 years, that I wanted to discuss with you is China. So China isn't necessarily going for the highest skyscraper record, but they're going for volume of skyscrapers. So they've been knocking off like copycats of a lot of different skyscrapers around the world. There's, knockoff models of a lot of different US cities. So in terms of volume of skyscrapers, China's got, tons of cities that are knocking these things off. So what's your view on that? Do you think that's a signal then that there's enormous misallocation of capital and waste then in China?
Oh, yes. I mean, there is an enormous misallocation of capital in China. There's no doubt about that. I mean, basically you have a central government that tells provincial governments that they must increase GDP by a certain amount, but they give them more or less unlimited hands-off access to bank money, whether it's the province themselves, private companies, or non-governmental entities. And someone did try to set a world record-setting skyscraper in China, and it was a company that started out as a air conditioning company, heating and cooling systems company, and they were based their business on prefabrication, and they eventually got into building the buildings themselves, and they could build these enormous structures in very little time because they would just make the sections of the building, railroad them to the site, and then put the pieces together. And so they plan to set not only a world record height skyscraper, but also in a world record time. And the Chinese government stopped them. And one of the reasons they were stopped was the claim that they would harm the environment. But in the major newspaper in China, in an editorial, mentioned the Skyscraper Curse. And
wow.
So, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't speak Chinese, so that's something that's unverified. But yeah, but your main point is absolutely correct. They've created a very artificial, very hyper-stimulated economy over there, and it's a very scary, risky sort of situation. And it's only, I think, the massive power of the Chinese Central Communist Committee structure that leads people to believe that they can control and stabilize any fallout from this very dangerous policy stance.
Yeah, I didn't see a separate chapter on China in your book, and I listened to your Tom Woods interview about the book, so I didn't hear you discuss China, but I think personally that they do have a real estate bubble there. They are building skyscrapers, not necessarily all the high ones like you said, but they are knocking them off. And according to one expert, Jim Chanos on Wall Street, he says that now 60% of China's GDP is based on speculative real estate construction. So if that is accurate, I mean, that's going to be the ultimate skyscraper curse. I don't want to give a timeline, prediction time, but if this continues, this is going to get out of control. The last 10 years, their credit bubble has gone to $40 trillion US. It's projected to go to over 50 trillion in just the next 5 to 7 years by the IMF. I mean, that's a lot of misallocation of capital.
Yeah, and it's almost something that I treat as a separate category in my own thinking and stuff. Because it's a different type of system that they have that makes this kind of construction boom possible. It's almost a mechanical-like system, and they're building everything from really extremely high skyscrapers to all sorts of things, including international airports, high-speed trains, all sorts of things, the Olympics, and they're even building ghost cities, cities that could, accommodate up to 1 million people that have very few people actually living in them. And so, it's the Chinese people are heavily involved in this speculation on real estate, the idea that the price will go up in the future. But also what we're seeing is that things like the Olympic Village and all the stadiums that they built, all of that's terribly depreciated and is not even in use for the most part. And then these ghost cities, you can't just leave a building, whether it's condos, apartments, or a house, you can't just leave it there and expect it to be the same thing when you come back a year or 2 years later. It's going to be physically depreciated. The construction was not great to begin with, and so there are reports on YouTube and elsewhere where people have gone to these ghost cities and shown that the older ones are breaking down, they're falling apart, they're being depreciated physically, while the owners think that they're going up in value. They're actually, in a very physical way, they're going down in value and might require significant upgrades and remodels just to make them livable, for the people who bought them.
And Mark, the Chinese did eminent domain on some of their Olympic stuff, so they kicked people out and they had to find a new home. They weren't, I don't even think they were given any money for private property rights or anything like that. But you mentioned the ghost cities. I have interviewed a few people who have lived in China a long time, Americans who moved there with General Motors, and they tell me some of those ghost cities, about 5 years later, Chinese do move in. So it's the more balanced analysis is that eventually some of those ghost cities do fill up, but yeah, sometimes it takes 5 years or more for people to start moving in because the Chinese who do move in, they want to see the infrastructure built, the sewer systems, transportation, schools, stuff around. But I think a major point here that based on all the stuff we've discussed is that a ton of Chinese money, whether it's in mainland China or it's in Vancouver or Toronto or Australia, that a ton of Chinese money from this credit bubble that they've had has gone all over the globe into real estate. I don't know about you, but anecdotally, I've just heard just crazy stories about Chinese businessmen like buying up, drastically overpaying for a property and then getting back on an airplane in 24 hours or less, sometimes buying multiple properties, sometimes sight unseen, sometimes paying all cash in a briefcase. Just crazy stories, willing to grossly overpay whatever the market price was. If it was in Vancouver, I've heard stories of them overpaying by hundreds of thousands of dollars over the asking price just to get a deal done immediately.
Oh, yeah, and, there's the obvious reason that they have money and they have access to money. But one of the big drivers in this phenomenon that you described is that the Chinese are pretty desperate about getting their money out of China. Now that they've made billions of dollars, they would like to see a certain percentage of their wealth outside of China because of, everything that might happen, including political instability. There's a lot of opposition to the Communist Party over there. There's a lot of demonstrations and, all sorts of things that are totally illegal, but are going on nonetheless. And so a lot of these very wealthy Chinese rightly think that it's a smart move to move money out of the country. There's limitations on that. And so very often you do see things like the money coming out, dribbling out via cash, moving of cash. Bitcoin is one of the reasons the Chinese are heavily cracking down on that. And also you'll see Chinese business people go to Macau and put the money through the casinos and then try to have the money redeposited in a foreign bank account. So there's all sorts of ways that I've heard about concerning this phenomenon, but that makes me worry more about the instability of the Chinese economy, given that these business people who have made so much money apparently see some severe risks in China.
Yeah, I totally agree. And China's doing too much central planning. I think the misallocation of capital is on a many trillions of dollar scale. China's using mercantilism. A lot of countries are using mercantilism now. Even President Trump is talking about it. He wants a weak currency to boost exports. But China's using a lot heavier dosage, I would say, of mercantilism because, they have a dollar peg. They're managing their currency exchange rate very, very heavily. And there's tons of other examples of the Chinese, even subsidizing a lot of their manufacturers to keep them in business. And they're, like you said earlier in the interview, they own their banks. So they've been, ordering their bankers to give out loans that they know that cannot be repaid. There's one estimate out there from a former People's Bank of China official that up to 80% of all the loans that these Chinese banks have given out are non-performing, that people are not even making payments on them. So eventually those loans are going to need to wiped away or bailouts or something like that.
Yeah, and your point about eminent domain, somebody described China as capitalism without property rights, and I think that's a valid thing and a valid point, and I think it's part of their mercantilist mindset is that they think that they can engineer the movement of China from a very, very primitive and poor, poverty-stricken country to a very rich and powerful country by these mercantilist mechanisms. And the real truth is that these mercantilist mechanisms actually end up destroying wealth and capital. They actually reduce the standard of living for the average Chinese worker consumer. So that's all hurting. What's actually worked in China, which is clear as the day is long, is the liberalization of their economy that they've made, that they've been able to attract direct foreign investment, that they've been able to mobilize their rural workforce into an urban manufacturing workforce where they've been able to develop entrepreneurship in their economy in terms of both the domestic economy and the export-driven economy and, of course, the real estate economy. That's not great entrepreneurship, but the entrepreneurial character of the Chinese people is clearly quickly responding to the market reforms. China has had a long history of liberalization and entrepreneurship and trade, only to be replaced by subsequent empires that suppress property rights and entrepreneurship and even prohibit international trade. And right now they're going through one of those good phases. And if they continue to liberalize and try not to force things like, they're trying to force this idea of the yuan being a global currency, a reserve currency, that'll all come in good time if they continue to work on the liberalization side of things rather than on the command and control approach that they use in other areas.
Yeah, and if you see some of the current events with the technology stuff that China's doing, they're going totalitarian and anti-freedom in that regard. But you brought up mercantilism more. For our listeners who are not familiar, Keynesian economics was not real economic innovation. It was basically a rehashing of mercantilism. If you read Murray Rothbard's biography of Keynes, which is free on the Mises website that you can download as an ebook, he talks in there about how, Keynesian economics, almost everything Keynes wrote was a rehashing and rewording, like basically new marketing material for mercantilism.
Yeah, there was one ancient mercantilist writer that sort of summarized mercantilism into 9 points. One of the points was make workers work as much as possible. The second point was use all land in the country, put it to use somehow or another. And the 7 other points were ways to rig your economy so as to get money to flow into your economy rather than to flow out of the economy. And of course, they went through hundreds of years of trying to create a situation where more gold is coming into your country than is going out, because they thought gold was wealth. Not, gold wasn't just money, it was actual wealth. And it's not until Richard Cantillon comes along in 1730 where he points out, money is not wealth. Wealth is the ability to produce and to consume. And so he showed that, mercantilist policies were all self-defeating policies, and they were also wrong policies. There were just a bunch of ways on how to eliminate your own resources.
Yeah, and I would also add that mercantilism is also very short-sighted. So it's about, producing results now, but it doesn't think about the long term as much. So it's very myopic. But, a lot of society has become that way. And, the arguments to be made that basically every country's economy is now on some type of, Keynesian economics or mercantilism model. So in your book, you mentioned Richard Cantillon now on the interview here, but in your book, you have a chapter on the Cantillon Effect. So briefly give our listeners who are not familiar what the Cantillon Effect is.
Sure. Well, Cantillon effects were not named by Richard Cantillon in 1730. That name only comes much, much later. But in Cantillon's analysis, he showed that an increase in the money supply changes demands in the economy and relative prices in an economy, and as a consequence, the production structure has to change. And if the money supply, once that new money works its way through the economy, that new structure of production may be very fragile and may cause significant economic troubles. And one of the examples that he gives is that if somebody discovers a new gold mine in a country and starts getting lots of gold and being able to sell lots of gold for lots of money, well, that gold mine owner and his workers will all get more money. They'll become richer. The owners will become richer. The workers will also have higher incomes, so much so that instead of eating bread and drinking beer, that they all might start eating meat and drinking wine. And so if that's going to be the case, Cantillon shows that, the structure of production is going to have to change. Instead of growing wheat and other grains for bread and beer, all of a sudden farmers are going to turn towards pasture lands to raise cattle for the beef, and they're going to use some of the farmland, instead of it growing it for grain, they're going to use it to grow grapes in order to make the wine. And so that changes the structure of incomes, and it changes the structure of production. And if that mine were to go barren a couple years from now and not be able to produce any gold, then the gold mine owner and the gold miners themselves, they'll lose those higher incomes and that wealth. And the farmers who have changed to produce beef and have changed to produce wine are going to find themselves out of luck and possibly go bankrupt. So that's the whole process. The modern Cantillon effect is usually discussed in terms of how increases in the money supply hurt some workers and help other workers, and in effect are redistributions of income and wealth. And of course, I think that's what we're seeing in our modern economy is central bankers issuing paper money have hurt the average ordinary worker but have benefited the very wealthy, who are the ones that have access to this money. So it exacerbates the income distribution issue in favor of the wealthy and harming wage workers.
Yeah, the way I heard the Cantillon Effect described more simply is that he noticed that when central bank or the government was creating more money and credit, that it often went to either the well-connected people in the political class or the bankers in the financial industry first. So the rich people that were connected to those two areas for the money spigot or the closest to the trough, they got the benefits first, and then maybe the people on Main Street or the poorer people, working class people, they got kind of a little bit on the trickle down, but they didn't get anywhere near the benefits that the other people did. And in the real world, Mark, we see this now because since the 2008 financial crisis, tens of trillions of dollars has been created. Real estate prices across the globe are up a lot, especially in major cities. We talked about some of them like Vancouver, Toronto, and many of the cities in Australia. Bond prices are up, so if rich people had a bond portfolio, they've done very well for the most part. And then a lot of the stock market has gone crazy with the NASDAQ now over 8,000 for the first time in history. It's higher than the tech bubble. CNBC today was pointing out when we're recording this on Thursday, August 30th, that this is the best performing NASDAQ since August of 2000. I'm not sure they should be comparing it to then because we had crashes then, but they are comparing it in a good way to then. And so the stocks and that. And then here in D.C., Mark, I'm not sure if you've been to D.C. lately. Maybe the Mises Institute should have an event here, and you guys can film a documentary with all the construction cranes, and you could use it for promotional materials to sell more copies of your book. But there's tons of construction cranes here in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Around the baseball stadium where the Washington Nationals play, Nats Park, they are demolishing all the old buildings and all the old things. There's at least 11 construction cranes there right now. And there's, construction cranes everywhere in the D.C. metro area, knocking down old buildings and replacing them with very expensive condos and multi-use buildings and commercial buildings.
Well, if I know Lou Rockwell pretty well, and I know Jeff Deist, our new president, real well too, and I don't think we're ever going to have a conference in Washington D.C. and we don't have to, because right here in little Auburn, Alabama, in East Alabama, we have in the last couple of years and going forward, we have our own skyscraper curse right here. I mean, in the housing bubble, I think they built a couple of buildings that were 4 or 5 stories high, but now they're building structures that are 6 and 7 stories high, mammoth apartment complexes. And so we're right here in the middle. We can see and have been able to see construction cranes for the last several years, and I think that this is a phenomenon that's quite common in above average economies. So if the main city in your area is above average, then it hasn't experienced this influx of real estate investing that tends to build structures taller than normal or taller than in the past. And so I'm pretty confident that what you're seeing is probably in a hyper-extended example of what the world is experiencing, because so much more money is injected into the economy of D.C. and the surrounding cities because of course, the federal budget and the largesse that is actually, spent locally. I have a young cousin who went to George Washington University and wanted to work in Washington, D.C. after graduation, and could not find an apartment, ended up going together with 3 friends. They finally found an apartment, and all 4 of them had to have their parents sign the contracts and back up the rent, and also to submit financial and tax records in order to get a lease on the apartment. So, that's just totally bizarre.
Crazy cost of living here. Yeah, this is New York City, D.C., and San Francisco area. The cost of living is just soaring. It's just soaring. And they're building, Mark, so this is not the Skyscraper Curse, but this is, a commercial real estate bubble, a new real estate bubble. They are building, further and further away from DC. They're building more expensive houses, more expensive shopping centers. There's a really beautiful monstrosity more than 45 minutes away from DC out in Loudoun County, which is the new hot county where I think the rumor is that Amazon may be building a large compound out there in the next couple of years. Amazon hasn't chosen their second location to move to yet, but the rumor is it's probably going to be out there somewhere in Loudoun County, around One Loudoun. There's a huge shopping center and mall and restaurants and housing and stuff like that out there. It's called One Loudoun. And so this is, an enormous centrally planned area further and further away from DC. And it's not cheap like you would think, because people in the past, in suburbs, if you're going to live further away, it would be cheaper, but that's not the case here. I guess this has to do with the Cantillon effects, right? Because the cost, even though the capital is being invested so people can have nice things, the cost on these things is not falling.
Yeah, I mean, well, any if you're near or inside a metropolitan area, the price of land has skyrocketed, and even on the periphery of metropolitan areas, you see the signs going up, land for sale. And the reason they're going up is because the price of land is so high, and Fed policy makes that that almost guarantees that land prices are going to rise. And so if land prices are extremely high, the only way to make a buck on real estate construction is to build higher. And that's one of the driving forces behind the Skyscraper Curse. It all begins with higher land prices as a result of artificially low interest rates, and then that more or less necessitates that real estate developers go higher. And of course, that also discourages the building altogether and the moving away to the periphery. So companies and individuals who can will, find a nice trade-off by moving further away from the metropolitan center, the commercial center. But then they have the trade-off of, yes, they've got more square footage, and yes, the schools are better, and there's less crime. But you also have maybe an hour commute. And who wants to do that? But that's the more intensified problem that people face when you get into situations like this, where Federal Reserve policy and artificially low interest rates have created this mania in the first place.
Agreed. And according to Danielle DiMartino Booth, who spoke at a recent Mises event, I think only a couple months ago in Texas, she thinks that there's a massive commercial real estate bubble in the U.S. that has been created with Fed policy as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's, somebody referred to this as the all things bubble.
Everything bubble, yeah. Like where, the everything bagel.
Everything.
Yeah, the everything bagel.
It's just, and, the commercial real estate, of course, you have people not just investing more, but you have people consuming more and hardly saving at all. And so existing businesses can continue and new businesses can continue because of the high rate of consumption that's going on during the bubble. Because, as you mentioned, stocks are up, bonds are up, housing prices are up. So people feel really wealthy, and so they're spending their entire paycheck, and that's keeping, all of these businesses going. It's here locally. It's bringing lots of high-quality priced restaurants. We have dozens of nail salons, and it's unbelievable. Auburn went from, I think, one yoga studio to probably about 6 or 7 And so, these are just signs of the time. And also, to a secondary degree, the changing nature of our economy, which is, it's where we consume certain things like yoga and restaurant meals that have to be more or less produced here, and then we have internet-based commerce that is providing lots of other things, household goods and clothing and shoes and that sort of thing. So there's a transition going on in our economy, as well as this bubble, the everything bubble.
And you mentioned in the Skyscraper Curse book another Auburn example of how there was very expensive condos for people who were supposed to go there for football games, and how they were being marketed as a way to, be more affordable than hotels and stuff like that. But then you said you compared them to staying in the most expensive hotels in Auburn and eating gourmet meals, and they were way more money. But people were tricked into, I guess, buying them because they assumed that housing prices would go up and that they could just sell it at a higher price. Well, the college I went to, Mark, Virginia Tech, right near our football stadium, weren't not as storied of a football program as Auburn is, but they did do the same thing with football condos, and the developer, I think, did go bust during the housing boom, and these expensive condos that they built near our football stadium, they had to turn them into student-like apartments just to get any cash flow. Yeah, after the bankruptcy, I think.
Yeah, I wrote about that during the housing bubble, and I think I wrote about it in 2007, and I was giving lectures. I gave a lecture here on campus, and when I showed up, it was for a student group on campus, and some students did show up, but also bankers and builders showed up, and they were really not very happy about what I had to say, and it was kind of a scary touch-and-go situation there, where for me to go, I had to go through the crowd in order to get out. So I was happy to leave that building that night. But yeah, I mean, here in 2000, I think it started in 2005, and it was still going strong at the end of 2007. And we had a half a dozen condominium complexes built. And one of them was right next to Taco Bell, so we call that Taco Casa. And one was built next to the McDonald's restaurant next to campus, so we call those Mac condos. And they were all designed for football people, and most of them have had to been converted into student apartments. And so what was once thought to go on sale during the bubble for $275,000 could not be sold a year later at auction for $180,000. And after that, I think it went into bankruptcy, and they had to break the codicil so that they could rent to unrelated college students. And that is that's just a fact of life. And despite the fact that all of the current builders can have to walk by the 2005, 2006, and 2007 structures, they're not seemingly phased in the least to build structures that are twice the size of those that were built during the housing bubble. And even the ones that have been open for quite some time, I don't think that they've are filled up to capacity at all.
It's a dangerous game that these developers are playing, Mark. As long as they have cheap capital, a lot of them, not all of them are going to do this. Maybe some of them will be more cautious after what happened in 2007 and 8. But at least some of them, as long as they can get cheap capital, they're going to gamble that they can get the building built and that they can sell off the units or sell the building to someone else. The hot potato thing. Try to get rich quick, make as much money as possible. So, the you have a good track record of calling the housing bubble. You were obviously you didn't give exact timing on it because that's not what Austrian School Economics is supposed to do. But talk about the track record of Austrian School Economics. So you were calling the housing bubble years in advance. You were trying to warn people. A lot of people didn't listen to the warnings. A lot of people didn't listen to Peter Schiff when he was warning about the housing bubble. A lot of people were laughing at him. There's that famous mortgage banker speech from a year or two before the housing bubble crashing. So just talk about, as we wrap up the interview here, the long-term track record of the Austrian School of Economics, calling these credit bubbles, these booms that eventually go bust.
Yeah, the second half of the book is devoted to this. And I look in particular at the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 1970s, the tech bubble, and the housing bubble. And it's very revealing about the differences between Austrian economists and mainstream Keynesian economists. The Austrian economists clearly understood that there were big problems in the economy, and they made their warnings right at the end of these long booms. And, simultaneously with that, you have mainstream Keynesian economists, whether it was Irving Fisher, the most prominent American economist in 1929 through 1931, or whether it was the Keynesian economists of the 1960s, the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors was claiming that the business cycle had been subdued. Arthur Oken was his name. While you have Austrians such as Mises, Rothbard, and Hazlitt making the calls beforehand, and then F.A. Hayek joining them during the 1970s, pointing out that if you don't do monetary reform, you're not going to be able to fix that problem. And, of course, they didn't fix the monetary problem until 1979 when they brought in Paul Volcker, and Volcker did exactly what the Austrians were recommending, which is to stop the inflation and allow all these troubled firms and assets to work themselves back into the economy through the process of unemployment, bankruptcy, and foreclosure. And that goes certainly true for the tech bubble as well. The long section in there about all of the Austrian economists who predicted what was going on, and all of the mainstream people who were basically clueless at the same time. And then we end up.
And Paul Krugman was calling for a housing bubble after the tech bubble crash too, if that's in the book, yeah.
Yes, it's something I published on Mises.org, a couple articles on that with some help, showing that Krugman actually called for a housing bubble early on, and they essentially followed his wishes. But the section on the housing bubble, I show that literally dozens of Austrian economists were right on the mark, not just, in terms of what would happen, but pretty good on terms of timing and magnitude and the reason why and how to fix it. And then you have the same thing on the other side with mainstream economists saying everything was great, the Fed was doing a great job. And Milton Friedman in December of 2006, when asked on the Charlie Rose show what he thought of what the Federal Reserve was doing, he said, they're doing great. They're the best Federal Reserve we've ever had. We've magnificently managed the economy. And so it's pretty much the same story over and over again. I'm not really cherry-picking any of this stuff. Certainly Austrians were wrong. Certainly Austrians have been early. Certainly there are perma-bears out there who claim to be Austrian economists. But I think the record is pretty clear, and that second half of the book I think is really solid evidence of the Austrian approach. And I think that if you were, for example, like a financial newsletter writer, you'd want to have all of that those quotes and those facts and those dates by the time the next crisis actually hits, because that's one of the things you're going to be writing about.
And Austrian School Economists, maybe they've called for recession or depression. Maybe it's not based on timing, but the Keynesians tend to say that one of the bad things that most Keynesians, even though Keynesians have never even read an Austrian book, many of them, they say the Austrians have called 5 of the last 3 depressions. But, that's still a better track record than Keynesians. I mean, there were Keynesians, you didn't mention this on the interview, maybe you mentioned this in the book, but there were Keynesians immediately after World War II saying that when the U.S. was going to cut military spending, that the economy was going to collapse because it wasn't planned. So, I mean, their track record of predictions, pretty much all Keynesians, has been totally garbage for a very, very long time. Whereas, the Austrians don't even get any media attention. Without the internet, the Mises Institute and YouTube with the lectures up on there, I'm not sure the Austrian School of Economics would be in as good a shape as it is in right now.
I think you're absolutely right, Jason. And, I hope all of your listeners either order a copy of the book. It's at mises.org/curse. But it's also where you can, look at an e-copy or download an audio file and spread it around. Talk about it. Let people know up front what you think is going to happen in advance. And that's, I think, the best way for us to take this platform that is Mises.org and spread it around on a day-to-day basis. People, your listeners, all have access to social media, and of course we have new stuff coming out every day, and a lot of it has to do with the current bubble, but it has also to do with many, many things that people are interested in. So I really encourage, if your listeners are already listening to alternative media, and that's a power to reckon with in the future, and I think we can start using it today to hopefully bring this regime down.
And I'm not sure if this is related to the Skyscraper Curse or not, Mark, but did you see that 2 months ago there was a Skyscraper movie with The Rock in it? It was set in Asia for this, fictional skyscraper, and they spent over $100 million on the movie, and the movie totally flopped.
Yeah, I did see that, and I was hoping that might help promote the book a little bit, but it turns out it apparently didn't do too well. And I haven't seen the movie, but it's about a very scary situation.
But maybe that is a signal, though, that people don't want to see skyscraper movies.
Could be a contrarian indicator.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you for your time today, and of course I want to promote this free audiobook for our listeners to download on the Mises website. I'll attach a link in the information section below the YouTube video, and it's the best price because a lot of my listeners, unfortunately, are cheapskates, so so they can download the audio.
That's smart. You want to be a cheapskate in this time, at this time, and have as much savings and as little debt as possible going into the problem.
In general, I would agree, except that there's hardworking people like me out there working their butts off to provide people with good content and interviewing experts like you on many other different topics. And then YouTube is basically making it so we can't earn a living with our content, and then people who listen to the content like it don't want to pay for it. So, that's my problem though, right? So
it's been great to be with you, Jason.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Talk again soon. Good luck with your book.
Take care.
Please like this video, share it with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the Wall Street for Main Street YouTube channel if you have not already done so. Thanks for helping Wall Street for Main Street pass the 20,000 YouTube channel subscriber milestone despite YouTube censorship. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to 30,000 or even 40,000 YouTube channel subscribers quickly if YouTube doesn't shut down this channel. If YouTube does shut down this channel, remember to also sign up for the Wall Street for Main Street email list that's on the wallstreetformainstreet.com website, and will tell you where the videos are going to be uploaded instead of YouTube. Also, If you really like the content and you decide that you want to give a one-time donation, you can go to the wallstreetformainstreet.com website where there's different options for you to do so. Or you can become a Patreon contributor. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to providing my loyal listeners with some of the best information, analysis, and financial education available out there, free or paid, as I work to grow the podcast and also get my educational technology company funded.